Today we're going to talk about the week 10 ions. Now, one thing I've told you over and over is that sometimes you have to memorize stuff, and sometimes there are tricks. And we've learned a lot of basics that if you know the trick then and memorize just a little bit, that you'll be fine. This week, week 10, is um, unfortunately a week where I do not have a lot of tips for you. This will be largely a just spend some time and go over them, make flashcards, uh, memorize them, get used to them day. Partly because three of the ions, selenate, arsenate, and silicate, uh, have elements in them that, other than the ides, don't really show up. You don't have like arsenite or selenite or um, or those kinds of things. And so, really, they just kind of show up here. Now, there is arsenide and selenide, which you should not confuse with these because we have the O's on these. Selenide and arsenide are just AS and SE, but these 8s have the O4 on them. Silicate is kind of an odd duck all to its own. It's the first time that any form of silicon shows up on our ion sheet, and so you just kind of memorize. And these can be a little confusing. Sometimes people think it's SeO3. Other times people think it's SiO4, and you might be able to come up with a little mnemonic of some sort that's going to help you remember which is which. But it's really just one of those things you got to drill and get used to. Um, so I will remind you the rule that most of the time, other than thiocyanate, uh, everything that starts with an S has a -2 charge. That's a general rule, except for thiocyanate, that always works. So that'll help you remember the charge on those two. Uh, Another way to think about it is that selenide and selenate have the same charge, which isn't always true of ides and eights, but it is for selenium. Also, arsenide and arsenate each have a charge of -3, so that is another thing. Thiosulfate is, there's that prefix thio again, so remember thio means sulfur, but this is thiosulfate, and this is a trick that's sort of helpful but sort of not, because if you say, well, that's sulfate, SO4, -2, so we have the thio means sulfur, and sulfate, because that's sulfate. You'll notice though, so if you rewrite that S2O4, that actually turns out to be not correct. It's actually S2O3, so you would actually have to think of like this sulfur as replacing one of those O's, so it becomes S2O3. But the charge, once again, is conserved. So, again, I don't know, these are not very helpful tips. As I mentioned, there's just kind of some memorizing to go on with these. Tartrate, um, not a whole lot to say about tartrate. It's actually an ion that I expect that you won't have as much trouble remembering because it's big and long and complicated and it scares you. So if you actually study, you'll probably spend more time on it. So it's these others that I'm more worried about. But C4H4O6 -2 tartrate. Um, yep, gonna gotta earn your money on this week's quiz. So have a good time with that.